Michael Grant was not a man who lived for chaos or drama. At 46, his days began the same way, almost down to the minute. Before the sun crested over the flat Texas horizon, he was already awake, no alarm needed. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as he fed Max, his loyal retriever, before stepping out onto the porch to watch the first streaks of daylight cut through the sky. Routine was Michael's anchor. He read the morning news in print. Not on a screen, he checked the day's reports, packed his files into a worn leather briefcase, and drove the same road into the city where he worked as a regional operations manager. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave him something he valued above all else: stability. And stability was the thread that had carried him through most of his adult life. At home, Julia was different. His wife of 14 years had always been the free spirit, spontaneous, drawn to people, to energy, to things Michael never quite understood but respected because they seemed to light her up. She worked as a holistic therapist, leading workshops in meditation and energy alignment. Speaking of balance and healing, for years, their contrast had been their strength. He was steady, she was wild. He was order, she was color. And somehow, it worked. But in the last year, Michael began to notice something had shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. Julia still smiled when he walked through the door. She still posted pictures of them together on social media, arms around each other at family gatherings or standing side by side in front of the Christmas tree. To anyone looking in, they seemed untouched by the years. Still strong, but Michael felt what the camera didn't show: an invisible distance. A quiet withdrawal that only a husband could recognize. Her text messages grew shorter. Where once she sent paragraphs about her day, now they came as one-word replies. She said she was tired more often. She filled weekends with retreats, new clients, and meetings that seemed to stretch long into the evenings. And though she still sat beside him on the couch, she no longer leaned her head against his shoulder. Michael wasn't blind. He wasn't the type to invent trouble where there was none. But a small seed of unease had begun to take root. He carried it silently, unwilling to confront her with suspicion. He had always believed in giving space, in trusting first. But trust, once steady as a rock, can begin to erode grain by grain. And then came a name. At first, it was just a passing mention: Ethan. Julia had met him at a retreat months earlier. She said he was a spiritual coach, someone who helped people discover new levels of awareness. Michael nodded politely, not giving it much weight. But soon, Ethan's name appeared more and more often in her stories. Ethan told me something that really resonated. Ethan says we all carry hidden energy patterns. Ethan believes couples grow when they explore together. Michael noticed the way she spoke the name, with admiration laced into every syllable. At first, he dismissed it as professional respect, the kind his wife often gave to other practitioners she admired. But admiration has shades, and husbands can sense when admiration crosses into something heavier. Ethan began to appear in conversations about their marriage. Julia would say, "Ethan thinks balance in relationships comes when both partners open themselves to new experiences." Or, "Ethan helped me see where we've been stuck." The tone was subtle, never outright suggestive, but it was persistent, weaving itself into the rhythm of their days. Michael listened. He did not confront, but inside, he felt the quiet sting of something he couldn't yet name. It was not jealousy. Jealousy is loud, hot, and reckless. What he felt was colder, more restrained, but just as painful. It was the awareness of a gap forming, a door being pushed open inch by inch, and the knowledge that someone else's shadow now fell across the threshold of his marriage. And so, Michael continued his mornings as if nothing had changed. He still rose before dawn, still fed Max, still carried his briefcase into the city. Outwardly, he was the same reliable man Julia had married. But inwardly, he had begun to study the details of his wife's life with sharper eyes. He measured the pauses in her speech, the moments she looked away, the sudden laughter at texts she didn't explain. Michael Grant was a man who valued loyalty and dignity above all. And though he didn't yet know where the road ahead would take him, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: when betrayal knocks, he would not answer with rage. He would answer with clarity. For now, he said nothing. But already, deep inside, a quiet storm had begun to form. Anniversaries were never extravagant in the Grant household. Michael didn't believe in diamonds or orchestrated displays meant for neighbors' eyes. He believed in quiet dinners, candlelight, and the comfort of routine turned sacred for one evening. 14 years deserved recognition. But in his mind, the celebration lived not in luxury, but in presence. That evening, he returned home early. He laid the table with care, poured a full-bodied Cabernet into their best glasses, and simmered a sauce on the stove that carried the smell of garlic and fresh basil through the house. A soft playlist hummed in the background. Old songs they once danced to in the living room when the world outside didn't matter. Julia arrived later than expected, her hair loose, her eyes bright with that restless energy Michael had learned to read. She kissed him lightly, complimented the aroma in the kitchen, and slipped into conversation as though nothing weighed between them. On the surface, it felt ordinary, but beneath the small talk, there was something rehearsed in her manner, as if she had come not just to share a meal, but to deliver a message. They ate together, the flicker of candles reflecting in her wine glass. Michael watched her carefully, the way she cut her food with deliberate slowness, the way her gaze avoided his for a second too long, the way she took a breath before speaking, as though summoning courage. And then, she said it, "Michael." Her tone was light, almost playful. "What would you think if Ethan joined us at the ranch for a weekend?" The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. At first, he wondered if he had misheard. Surely, she hadn't suggested bringing another man into the sanctuary of his father's ranch, the place where he felt closest to family, to history, to the life he had built. But no, her eyes held steady. Her lips curved in a faint, practiced smile. She had thought about this moment. She had rehearsed it. She went on, as if the suggestion were perfectly natural. "He's helped me see things in myself, in us. I think having him there could open new doors. It might bring us closer." Michael set down his fork. He looked at her across the table, not with anger, but with the kind of stillness that can be more terrifying than rage. A dozen responses burned in his chest, each one demanding release, but he gave them none of it. Instead, he lifted his glass, clinked it gently against hers, and smiled. "Sure," he said softly. "Why not?" Julia's shoulders relaxed with relief. She smiled back, convinced she had guided the conversation safely, unaware that something far deeper had shifted in the space between them. For Michael, that was the moment. Clarity replaced doubt. There would be no more second guessing. No more wondering if the late nights and vague explanations were harmless. The suggestion alone told him what he needed to know. His wife had already invited Ethan into her heart, and now she wanted him welcomed into their lives. But Michael was not a man who fought fire with fire. He did not shout, nor did he expose his hurt in raw anger. He let her believe she had won a small battle, all the while knowing he had already chosen the battlefield for the war ahead. As Julia talked on, explaining how Ethan's presence would be transformational, Michael only nodded, sipping his wine, appearing thoughtful. He was, in truth, thoughtful, just not about Ethan's philosophies or Julia's newfound beliefs. He was thoughtful about proof, about timing, about the precise way truth could be revealed so that denial had no oxygen left to breathe. Inside, a cold resolution settled. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about strategy. Julia had opened a door, and Michael would not close it with desperation or pleading. He would step through it, carefully, silently, and he would make sure that when the truth revealed itself, it would be undeniable. That night, as Julia drifted into sleep beside him, Michael lay awake in the dark, his mind no longer restless but crystal clear. There would be no shouting matches, no begging, no empty threats. She wanted to test the limits of their marriage. Very well. He would show her what limits really were. And so, the anniversary ended not with love renewed, but with a quiet decision forged in Michael's heart. If betrayal was the road she had chosen, then justice would be the path he carved in return. And when the time came, Julia would discover that her husband's silence had never been weakness. It was preparation. The days that followed the anniversary dinner carried a strange quiet. Julia walked with a lightness Michael had not seen in months, as though her proposal had lifted some secret burden from her shoulders. She hummed while making coffee, tapped her foot to songs on the radio, and spoke of the weekend at the ranch as though it were a retreat designed by destiny itself. Michael, however, had no such lightness. His movements were calm, deliberate, but beneath them lived the precision of a man sharpening a blade. He made the arrangements for the ranch, calling ahead for the heater to be checked, the locks to be oiled, the air filters replaced. Every detail was accounted for. But while Julia believed these preparations were for her comfort, Michael knew they were part of something larger, something she could not yet see. One evening, after Julia left for a late client session, Michael picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The voice that answered brought back memories of youth, of high school summers, of a friend who had always spoken with honesty when others chose flattery. "Rebecca Hayes," she said warmly, the sound of city noise in the background. "Rebecca," Michael replied, his voice steady. "It's been too long." They spoke briefly, catching up. But Michael did not waste time. He explained he needed her presence at the ranch that weekend. Not as a lawyer, not even as an advisor, but as a witness, someone whose calm strength could shift the balance of power. Rebecca asked few questions. She trusted him, as she always had, though she gave one quiet warning. If this turns into one of those stories that ends with shattered lives, Michael, make sure you're ready for the fallout. Michael's reply was calm, almost chilling in its certainty. "I'm not sure how it ends, but I promise, it will be unforgettable." Meanwhile, Julia prepared as though she were stepping into a sacred ritual. She shopped for wines and candles, stacked meditation books in her bag, and folded a new white linen dress with reverence, as if clothing could sanctify intentions. She spoke of Ethan more freely now, weaving his name into conversations with casual ease. "Ethan says the ranch will be perfect for opening energy channels. Ethan believes water and nature unlock deeper truths." Her words carried the tone of someone already rehearsing an introduction, as though she could hardly wait to merge two worlds, her husband's and her mentor's, under one roof. Michael listened, never interrupting. To her, his silence must have seemed like agreement. In truth, it was calculation. Every sentence she spoke only solidified his plan. Every reference to Ethan's wisdom only tightened the rope she was unknowingly weaving around herself. The morning of the trip arrived bright and unassuming. Julia's laughter filled the car as they drove out of the city. She reached for Michael's hand, squeezed it, and spoke of how this weekend would be a turning point. Michael kept his eyes on the road, smiling faintly, but his mind was elsewhere, on the porch of the ranch, where Rebecca would already be waiting. The ranch itself was sacred ground for Michael. It had belonged to his father, a man who believed that land carried memory. To Michael, every board, every tree, every gust of wind across that open space held the echo of family. It was the one place he could never imagine tarnished by deception. And so, he chose it as the stage where truth would begin to unfold. When the car pulled into the long gravel driveway, Julia leaned forward eagerly, already imagining incense by the fireplace, long conversations under the stars, and the arrival of the man who had so completely captured her admiration. But then, she froze. Rebecca was there, standing on the porch, a glass of wine in hand, her posture calm, her presence undeniable. She smiled warmly at Michael, then turned her gaze toward Julia, whose face had gone pale. "Rebecca." Julia's voice trembled slightly, betraying her confusion. Michael lifted the suitcases from the trunk with quiet ease, then looked at his wife with a calmness that masked everything brewing beneath. "I thought it'd be nice to have someone special here too," he said. The words landed heavy. For Julia, the weekend she had planned so carefully had already slipped from her control. For Michael, the first move had been made not in anger, but in silence, in strategy, in the quiet power of a man who had decided the rules of the game would no longer belong to anyone but him. And with that, the stage was set. The first night at the ranch was meant to be peaceful, but peace never came. Dinner was laid out simply: steak seared in cast iron, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine opened and breathing. Michael and Rebecca carried the conversation easily, reminiscing about old days, trading small stories, weaving laughter into the air as if nothing at all were amiss. But Julia could not hide her discomfort. She smiled when expected, laughed a half second too late, and fidgeted with her phone more often than she touched her fork. Every so often, her gaze flicked toward Rebecca's wine glass, or to Michael's calm expression, as though trying to decode a puzzle she hadn't anticipated. For Michael, it was a quiet study in contrasts. On one side of the table sat Rebecca, comfortable, relaxed, present. On the other side sat Julia, tense, distracted, her mind elsewhere, waiting for a message that never came. He didn't need to know the contents of her thoughts. Her restless hands and darting eyes told him everything. The evening dragged on, heavy not because of arguments, but because of silence, the kind of silence that grows thicker with each passing minute. Julia excused herself early, citing fatigue, leaving Michael and Rebecca to finish the last of the wine. When Rebecca rose to leave the next morning, she hugged Michael firmly, whispered, "You know what you're doing," and drove off toward Atlanta. The moment her car disappeared down the gravel road, Julia emerged from the bedroom, suitcase in hand. Her voice was clipped, defensive. "I need to get back to the city. I've got a headache. Maybe I had too much wine last night. I'm just not in sync with this place right now." Michael only nodded, his expression unreadable. He offered no protest, no questions. He simply watched as she loaded her bag into the trunk and drove away, her white dress still hanging in the closet where she had planned to wear it. For Julia, it was an escape. For Michael, it was confirmation. As soon as her taillights disappeared into the distance, Michael picked up his phone and dialed another number, one he had saved quietly days earlier. Daniel Cross, a private investigator with a reputation for precision and discretion. Daniel didn't waste words. He listened, asked for the necessary details, and within an hour he was in motion. The day stretched long and quiet at the ranch. Michael busied himself with small tasks, chopping wood, walking the perimeter, feeding Max. Outwardly, it looked like any other day. But inside, he waited with the calm patience of a man who already knew the ending, only needing the proof to write it down. By late afternoon, the first message arrived. A photo. Grainy but unmistakable Julia stepping into the lobby of a boutique hotel in Charlotte. Her hair tucked neatly, her dress casual but chosen. Minutes later, another image, Ethan arriving, cap pulled low, sunglasses hiding his face, as though secrecy could protect him from the truth. More images followed. Julia and Ethan seated together in the hotel restaurant, leaning close, laughing with the intimacy of more than friends. Another photo captured them walking hand in hand through a quiet art gallery, their bodies angled toward each other, unaware of the camera in the distance. The final image sealed everything, both of them entering her room, key card flashing green, the door closing behind them. There was no ambiguity, no spiritual mentorship, no platonic guidance, no innocent friendship. The photos spoke with the clarity Julia had tried so long to avoid. Michael scrolled through them slowly, his expression calm, almost detached. There was no shock left to feel, no room for denial. In his heart, he had known this truth for weeks, maybe months. The difference now was that he could hold it in his hands. Disappointment settled in, heavy but cold, not the kind that stirs rage, but the kind that clears the fog. Julia's betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was documented, undeniable, and with that, Michael's decision, formed in silence days earlier, became iron. He closed the phone, poured himself a glass of water, and stepped out onto the porch. The evening air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Max lay at his feet, ears twitching, sensing his master's stillness. Michael did not plan revenge. He planned resolution. The game Julia had set in motion with her casual suggestion at the anniversary dinner was no longer hers to control. The proof was his now, and with it, he would decide the time, the place, and the manner in which the truth would be revealed. The cracks had shown, wide enough for the truth to pour through, and soon, Julia would learn that the calmest storms are often the most devastating. The days after the ranch were quiet. But silence was never a shield. It was a preparation. Michael knew his next step. Proof. Left to sit in the dark. Was only evidence. But proof. Revealed under the right light. Could be truth undeniable. He thought carefully about who should see it first. Who would cut through Julia's defenses faster than any lawyer or judge? The answer came without hesitation. Evelyn. Julia's mother. A woman of elegance and conviction. Who had always called Michael the kind of man her generation feared, was disappearing steady. Principled. Unwavering. Evelyn loved her daughter. But she also valued integrity. And Michael knew that when faced with the reality of betrayal, Evelyn would not protect lies, so he extended the invitation for a simple dinner at their home. Julia hesitated when he told her. Her eyes narrowed. Her tone carried unease. Why now? It's not exactly a special occasion. Michael only smiled and said it would be good to spend time together. She did not press him further, though her posture betrayed suspicion. On the night of the dinner, Julia busied herself in the kitchen. Her movements sharp. Distracted. She straightened the tablecloth twice, rearranged the candles 3 times, and kept glancing at Michael, as though waiting for some sign of what he was truly planning. But Michael gave nothing away. His calm was unshakable. When Evelyn arrived, she stepped into the room with her usual grace, dressed in deep blue, carrying a warm apple pie. She kissed Michael's cheek and greeted Julia with maternal tenderness. They sat together, chatting about weather, politics, the latest trends in holistic health. For a while, the evening felt ordinary, pleasant even, and then Evelyn lifted her napkin. Folded neatly beneath it was a photograph. Julia, smiling too brightly, walking hand in hand with Ethan outside the hotel in Charlotte. Evelyn froze, her breath catching as she stared down at the image. Her eyes scanned it once, then twice. Her face draining of color, she set the napkin aside and reached for her water, only to notice another photo tucked beneath the glass. This one showed Julia and Ethan leaning close across a restaurant table, their bodies angled with the unmistakable posture of intimacy. Evelyn's hand trembled as she lifted it. The room grew heavy, the air thick. Julia's fork clattered against her plate as she reached forward, trying to snatch the photos away. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. But before she could gather them, Evelyn pulled back, clutching the photos with trembling fingers. Her eyes lifted to her daughter, wet with disbelief. "Julia," she whispered, "tell me this isn't true." Julia's mouth opened, but no words came, only silence, broken by the sound of her mother's unsteady breath. Evelyn set the photos down slowly, as though they carried weight too heavy to hold. She rose from the table, shaking her head, tears shining in her eyes. Michael stood and spoke softly, his voice steady. "You don't need to see any more of this. I'll call a car to take you home. I'm sorry you had to discover it this way, but you deserve to know who your daughter has become." Evelyn said nothing. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if steadying herself, then turned and walked out the door without a backward glance. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia stood frozen, eyes wide, her lips pressed tight, as if she were fighting not to scream or collapse. Finally, she turned on Michael, her voice sharp with accusation. "That was cruel. How could you humiliate me in front of my own mother? What kind of man does that?" Michael's response was calm, but his words cut sharper than any shout. He looked her straight in the eyes, his tone like steel. "Cruel was you asking me to share my marriage bed with another man. Cruel was you suggesting we invite your lover to the ranch my father left me. I didn't humiliate you, Julia. I only showed you what you refused to admit." Her face flushed with anger, her mouth open to argue. But no defense came, because there was none. The evidence lay scattered across the table. The silence in the house was no longer her weapon, it was his. In that moment, Julia understood that the balance of power had shifted completely, and Michael, for the first time in months, no longer felt like the betrayed man. He felt like the man who had reclaimed his voice. The storm broke not with shouts, but with a single sentence. Michael stood in the living room, the scattered photos still visible on the table, his gaze steady, unrelenting. "Say it," he told her. "No detours. No excuses. Just the truth. Julia's lips trembled. She looked at the floor, then at him, and finally let the words fall like stones. I cheated on you. The confession echoed in the silence. It was the sound of a marriage collapsing under its own weight. No more illusions. No more deflections. The final nail had been driven, and there was no pulling it back out. Michael did not shout, did not gloat. He only left the room briefly and returned with a blue folder in his hand. Inside were divorce papers, already drawn up by his attorney. He placed them firmly in front of her. I spoke with my lawyer this morning, he said calmly. These outline how the separation will proceed. The house, the ranch, the inheritance protected by law, they remain with me. You leave with what you brought into this marriage. Nothing more. Julia's eyes widened. Her voice cracked with disbelief. You can't do this. This is cruel. Michael's reply was dry. Razor. Sharp. Cruel was you destroying 14 years for a man who vanished the moment things turned difficult. Cruel was you trying to dress betrayal as growth. This is not cruelty. This is consequence. Within weeks, Julia packed her belongings, just 2 suitcases, and left. She rented a modest apartment in Charlotte. Her once thriving clinic, shrinking as clients drifted away. Sensing the disorder behind her practiced smile, even her mother's gaze grew cold. No longer filled with admiration, only disappointment. Ethan, the so-called mentor, disappeared almost instantly. He stopped returning calls, blocked her number, vanished from the retreats where he once preached connection. To him, Julia had been nothing more than a fleeting chapter, discarded without ceremony. Michael, meanwhile, discovered something unexpected in the silence of his now empty home. Peace. The mornings were still, the nights calm, and for the first time in years, he felt whole rather than hollow. What Julia had mistaken for weakness had been patience. What she had mistaken for cruelty had been justice. And from the ashes of betrayal, Michael began to build something new, not revenge, not bitterness, but purpose. In the months that followed, Michael's life took a quieter shape. The house, once echoing with tension, now carried only the sound of morning coffee brewing, the rustle of newspaper pages, and the steady breath of his dog at his feet. But silence was no longer heavy. It was liberating. He chose not to bury himself in bitterness. Instead, he began to meet with men in his community, divorced fathers, husbands blindsided by betrayal, men who had tasted humiliation and didn't know how to rise again. Michael spoke to them not about revenge, but about dignity. He told them the strength of a man wasn't in how loudly he shouted when wronged, but in how firmly he stood without losing himself. Don't let betrayal define you, he would say. Let it refine you. His words carried weight because they came from experience, not theory. Men listened. Some walked away in silence. Some stayed to ask questions. But all of them saw in Michael something rare, a man who had endured the fire without letting it consume his soul. Then, one afternoon in Asheville, Michael walked into a cafe and saw Julia. Time had not softened her. She looked thinner, restless, with eyes that carried the burden of choices made too carelessly. She froze when she saw him, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I never imagined, she said bitterly, that you could do to me what you did. Michael folded his newspaper, looked at her calmly, and answered, I never imagined you could do to me what you did. We're even. There was no malice in his tone, only truth. Julia lowered her gaze, muttered something inaudible, and slipped out the door, leaving Michael once again in peace. And so his story found its true ending, not in revenge, not in destruction, but in freedom. Betrayal doesn't just end a marriage, it remakes a man. Julia thought she was in control, but Michael learned that control comes from truth, from silence, and from walking away with dignity. In the end, he didn't win by destroying her. He won by not letting her destroy him. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that cut to the truth of betrayal, justice, and dignity.